There's an old lie, soft and worn like a favorite armchair, that tells a man comfort is the reward for a life well lived. It whispers, "Play it safe, son. Don't rock the boat. Just keep your head down and you'll get by." And for most of us, that lie sounds a whole lot like wisdom. We chase it, build fences around it, settle into it like a warm bath on a cold night. But the truth, the raw, ugly truth, is that comfort ain't a reward, it's a trap. It's a slow-setting concrete that binds you tighter with every passing year, until one day you realize the greatest risk you ever took was doing nothing at all. Clayton knew that lie intimately. At 48 years old, he embodied the quiet strength of a man who'd been putting in the hours, day after day, for longer than he cared to remember. His hands, gnarled and powerful, bore the geography of 1,000 small cuts and calluses from the factory floor, etched deeper than any map. They were honest hands, hands that built, fixed, and hauled. You could see the work in the permanent slight bend of his fingers, the way they never quite relaxed. His face wasn't weathered like an old sea dog, but rather like a stone worn smooth by a steady current, lines around his watchful, observant eyes that spoke of long shifts and silent worries. He wasn't loud, never the type to hold court at the local bar. He preferred to listen, to watch, to take it all in before offering a nod or a gruff, clipped word that usually carried more weight than a speech. Dependable, people called him. Predictable. The kind of man you could set your watch by, even if that watch was telling him it was time for another 12-hour shift at the stamping plant. He looked like he could stand for days without complaint, a pillar against the relentless grind. But if you looked close enough past the quiet resolve, you might catch a flicker of something else, a distant ache, a yearning tucked deep behind those tired eyes. He was Clayton, a factory man through and through, living a life he thought he'd chosen. He was Clayton, a factory man through and through, living a life he thought he'd chosen. The shriek of the 5 a.m. alarm was less a sudden shock and more a rusty key turning in a familiar lock. It was the sound that unlocked Clayton's day, every single weekday for over 2 decades. Before the sun even thought about stretching its pale fingers across the sky, Clayton was already out of bed, the floorboards groaning a familiar tune beneath his weight. His modest, single-story house, built in the faded glory days of the 70s, sat on a street where every lawn was neat, every bush trimmed, and every dream seemed to be neatly tucked away behind closed doors. It was a good house, well-maintained, a testament to steady hands and a careful budget. Sarah, his wife, would already be up, a quiet hum in the kitchen as coffee brewed and toast popped. Their mornings were a silent choreography honed by years of practice. He'd pour himself a mug, thick and black, and sit at the worn kitchen table, listening to the muffled sounds of their kids, Mark and Lily, slowly rousing in their own rooms. Mark, 19, was a blur of nervous energy, already halfway through college applications. Lily, 15, was a whirlwind of teenage drama and boundless potential. He loved them fiercely, a quiet, unyielding love that was the bedrock of his existence. He'd nod at Sarah, a silent communication that spoke volumes more than words, and she'd return it with a soft smile, her own quiet strength mirroring his. By 5:45 a.m., he was in his beat-up pickup truck, the engine grumbling its own ancient song. The drive to the stamping plant was a blur of pre-dawn streets, the same turns, the same traffic lights, the same stretch of highway lined with warehouses that all looked identical in the fading darkness. He knew every pothole, every shadow. At the plant, the air tasted of hot metal and hydraulic oil, a familiar tang that had long since replaced the smell of fresh coffee as the true start of his day. The clatter of machinery, the rhythmic thud of presses, the high-pitched whine of grinders, it was a symphony of industry, a deafening comfort. He'd punch in, pull on his gloves, and step onto the line, merging into the stream of men and women who moved with practiced efficiency, each a cog in the massive, churning machine. 8 hours, sometimes 12, spent feeding sheets of steel into presses, checking gauges, stacking finished parts. His body knew the dance by heart, his mind often drifting, a quiet observer of the repetitive ballet. The paycheck, though steady, was a tightrope walk. Every month was a delicate balancing act. The mortgage, the utility bills that crept up like weeds, the groceries, the kids' school supplies, the ever-present car repairs. It was a constant game of Tetris with the numbers in his bank account, always trying to make the last block fit. There was no real slack, no margin for error, just enough to keep the engine running, to keep the lights on, to keep the kids fed and clothed. Comfortable enough, he'd tell himself, a mantra he'd repeated for years. But comfortable enough. Felt less like a reward and more like a cage, its bars fashioned from routine and predictability. Sometimes, late at night when Sarah was asleep beside him, the silence in the house would echo with ghosts of choices not made, paths not taken. He'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, the quiet dread of an unfulfilled life a dull ache beneath his ribs. He remembered the eager kid he'd been, fresh out of high school, full of half-baked ideas and a restless energy that felt wasted now. There'd been talk once of going to trade school for something more intricate, more challenging than stamping steel. He'd even saved up a little, toyed with the idea of starting a small repair business on the side, just him and his tools. But life, as it often does, had a way of gently nudging you towards the path of least resistance. A good job offer at the factory, the security of a union, then Sarah, then Mark, then Lily. Each step felt right, felt responsible. He'd always told himself smart money was steady money, that avoiding risk was being practical. But a part of him, a younger, wilder part, whispered that steady was just another word for stuck. He carried a deep-seated fear of stagnation, a quiet ambition that he'd learned to bury under layers of quiet resignation. He wanted more, not for himself necessarily, but for the flicker of potential he saw in his children's eyes. He saw Mark poring over college brochures, Lily sketching fantastical worlds in her notebook, and a surprising vulnerability would seize him. A fear that his own choices, his comfortable inaction, might somehow limit their possibilities. He had always been so good at enduring discomfort without complaint on the factory floor, a physical discomfort that was finite and understood. But this inner discomfort, this gnawing feeling of being tethered to a life he hadn't fully chosen, felt infinite, undefined, and far more terrifying. He told himself it was just a passing thought, the late-night ramblings of a tired mind. But the thought always returned, a relentless drip, drip, drip of quiet regret. The thought always returned, a relentless drip, drip, drip of quiet regret. It was usually the first thing that hit him when his eyes flickered open at 5 a.m., before the alarm even had a chance to let out its tinny electronic squawk. Another day, another sunrise he wouldn't truly see, just a dull graying of the sky through his bedroom window. He'd swing his feet out of bed, the worn rug cool beneath his calloused soles, and the rhythm would begin. Coffee, black as a welder's lung, brewed while he packed his lunch. 2 sandwiches, usually turkey, a bruised apple, maybe a handful of pretzels. Sarah would still be asleep, Lily dreaming in her room down the hall, Mark probably still up, burning the midnight oil on some college application essay. Clayton would move through the quiet house like a ghost, each movement economical, ingrained. He'd pull on the same faded work jeans, the same heavy flannel shirt, the steel-toed boots he'd polished every Sunday for years until the leather shone like obsidian. A quick glance in the bathroom mirror, the lines around his eyes a little deeper, the gray in his temples a little thicker. He'd splash cold water on his face, trying to wash away the residue of those restless thoughts. The drive to the factory was a blur of familiar turns and dim streetlights. His old pickup, a relic almost as sturdy and reliable as himself, grumbled along, the radio tuned to a classic rock station, just loud enough to fill the silence without demanding attention. He knew every pothole on Industrial Way, every broken curb, knew the exact moment the factory lights would bleed into the pre-dawn gloom, a stark beacon against the dark sky. Knew the smell that hit him the moment he stepped out of the truck, a mix of hydraulic fluid, cooling metal, and the faint, acrid tang of burnt wires. It was the smell of his life. Inside, the cacophony was immediate. The rhythmic clang of the presses, the whine of the grinders, the hiss of pneumatic tools. Clayton's station was in Assembly Line C, where he'd spend the next 8 hours doing what he'd done for 25 years. Fitting, bolting, checking, inspecting. His hands, gnarled and strong, moved with an practiced efficiency that bordered on unconsciousness. He could assemble a complete unit blindfolded, his fingers finding every groove, every screw, every connection point by feel alone. The work was honest, dependable. It provided, but it also dulled. It was a conveyor belt for his mind, too, moving steadily forward, carrying the same parts, the same motions, the same thoughts, day in, day out. And those thoughts, they were the real weight. Sometimes, as he tightened a bolt or calibrated a sensor, a memory would flash. A younger Clayton, greasy-haired and bright-eyed, sketching out plans for some wild contraption in a dusty garage. A dream of building something his own, something innovative, not just assembling pieces of someone else's invention. He saw the gap wide as a canyon between that hopeful young man and the one standing on the factory floor now, clocking in and clocking out. He'd once wanted to be a creator, a problem solver on his own terms. Now he was just part of the solution someone else had already designed. Money was always tight, a thin wire stretched taut across their lives. He made a good wage, a steady wage, but life kept getting more expensive. Groceries, utilities, the increasing cost of Mark's college applications, Lily's art supplies, the slow drip of household repairs. He'd open the mailbox to a stack of envelopes, each one a small puncture in their peace of mind. He and Sarah were good at stretching a dollar, experts at doing without. But lately, doing without felt less like being frugal and more like holding his breath. He knew Sarah saw it in his eyes, too, that quiet exhaustion, that worry he tried to hide behind a gruff grunt or a mumbled reassurance. He'd come home, supper would be on the table, Sarah's quiet strength a balm. Lily would chatter about her day, her drawings spread across the kitchen table like vibrant dreams. Mark would talk about his classes, his aspirations, his whole future unfolding, bright and boundless. And in those moments, watching his children, a pang would hit him deep in the chest. He saw their potential, a bright, undeniable spark, and felt a suffocating fear that his own comfortable cage, his predictable routine, might somehow limit them. That his quiet surrender to what is might prevent them from reaching what could be. His greatest demon wasn't a monster in the dark, it was the quiet voice of resignation. The voice that said, "This is good enough, Clayton. Don't rock the boat. You're too old. It's too late. You've got responsibilities." That voice had been a trusted companion for years, whispering comfort, whispering safety. But now, it sounded more like a prison warden, rattling the bars, keeping him from a freedom he'd forgotten he even desired. He wanted to tell them, to tell Sarah, to tell Mark and Lily about the dreams he'd buried, the ambition he'd bricked up inside himself. But the words always got stuck, a lump in his throat, choked by the comfortable silence of his unfulfilled life. He had built a life on avoiding discomfort, and in doing so, he had built a life that was slowly, silently suffocating him. It started, as these things often do, not with a bang, but with the quiet rustle of an envelope. Supper was winding down. Mark, halfway through a textbook, kept darting glances at the stack of mail. Among the bills and junk, a thick, cream-colored envelope lay, emblazoned with the crest of the state university, his dream school. Clayton felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a mix of hope and dread. He'd seen that look on Mark's face for months, the quiet, determined hope of a young man aiming for something bigger than this town. Clayton remembered his own buried hopes suddenly feeling their weight. "Go on, son," Sarah said, nudging Mark toward the counter. "It's been sitting there since lunch." Mark's hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he picked it up. He tore it open with deliberate care, pulling out a sheaf of papers. His eyes scanned the first page. Clayton felt his own breath catch. Mark's face at first bloomed with a joy that lit up the whole kitchen. A wide, incredulous grin stretched across his features, his eyes shining as he saw the bold, black letters. "Congratulations accepted." For a fleeting second, the air in the room seemed to lift, filled with the warmth of shared victory. Then, slowly, the light in Mark's eyes began to dim. Flipped a page, then another, his brows furrowing. The smile faltered, pulled down at the corners by an invisible weight. He muttered something under his breath, a sound Clayton couldn't quite catch, but he knew what it was. Knew it in the pit of his stomach, in the tightening knot behind his ribs. Mark cleared his throat, pushing the papers away slightly. "I got in. Yeah, but..." He gestured vaguely at the financial aid breakdown, avoiding eye contact. "The scholarship, it's not what we hoped." "Not even close. There's still a big gap." He tried to sound nonchalant, like it was just a minor inconvenience, but his voice cracked on the last word. The hopeful spark that had filled him moments before had vanished, leaving behind only the dull ache of disappointment. He was trying to protect them, Clayton realized, trying to soften the blow. But the blow landed anyway, straight to Clayton's gut. He looked at Mark's slumped shoulders, at the way his son picked at a loose thread on his jeans, at the way Sarah reached out, her hand hovering, unsure what to do. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. It wasn't a comfortable silence like the ones he'd cherished in his routine. This was the silence of a dream deflating, a future suddenly looking out of reach, all because he hadn't pushed harder, hadn't reached further. This right here was the most profound discomfort he'd ever faced, shaking him out of his complacency, not for himself, but for his boy. Later that night, long after Sarah had drifted off, and the gentle hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house, Clayton found himself in his old armchair in the living room. The TV was off, the room lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. He held Mark's acceptance letter, the same one that had brought joy and then such a deep, cold dread. He ran his thumb over the university crest, a symbol of everything he wanted for his son, everything he hadn't quite managed to provide. He thought about Mark's face, the effort he'd put into hiding his disappointment, the forced, brave smile. That smile was a punch to the gut. What kind of father was he, whose comfort had become a barrier to his son's future? He saw his life laid out before him, stark and unembellished. 48 years old, factory job, steady, yes, but dead end. The mortgage that felt like it would never truly be paid off. The constant juggling of bills, the modest house, the reliable but aging car. He had worked hard, sure, but he had also chosen the path of least resistance every single time. He had wrapped himself in the soft blanket of routine, mistaking predictability for security, contentment for fulfillment. He'd avoided risks, dodged challenges, believing he was smart, being responsible. But what had that comfort brought him? It had brought him to this chair at 3 a.m., staring into the dark, feeling the crushing weight of his inadequacy. It had brought him to the realization that his safe life wasn't enough to give his kids a better one. His prudence had been nothing more than fear disguised as wisdom. He had been so afraid of falling he'd forgotten how to climb. He had been so afraid of discomfort he had chosen a slow, quiet suffocation. A quiet "enough" escaped his lips, barely audible even to himself, yet it echoed in the silent room with the force of a thunderclap. Not enough blame, not enough regret, not enough excuses. Just enough. He didn't know what came next. He didn't have a plan, not a single damn step mapped out. But he knew, with a certainty that vibrated through his bones, that he couldn't continue like this. He couldn't go back to the comfortable trap. He couldn't face another morning knowing his inaction had cost his son his shot. The fear of an unfulfilled life, his own, now compounded by the fear of an unfulfilled life for his boy, was a heavier burden than any discomfort he could ever imagine facing. The next morning, the 5 a.m. alarm screamed its usual summons, but something felt different. The air in the house still carried the phantom scent of disappointment from the night before. Clayton rolled out of bed, the familiar ache in his knees sharper than usual, but a new, unfamiliar resolve solidified in his chest. He looked at the old desktop computer in the corner of the small den, the one he mostly used for bills and the occasional news article. It felt like a foreign object, a tool for a world he wasn't part of. His usual routine after breakfast was to grab his lunch pail, kiss Sarah, and head out. Today he hesitated. The thought of adding even 10 minutes to his morning, 10 minutes of uncertainty, felt like pushing against a concrete wall. His body screamed for the familiar, for the easy flow of habit. But the memory of Mark's face, of the big gap in the financial aid, was a colder, sharper goad. He walked over to the desk, his movements stiff, almost reluctant. He sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. The dust motes danced in the sliver of dawn light coming through the window. He powered on the computer. It whirred to life, slow and groggy, just like he felt. What was he even looking for? He had no idea. He just knew he had to start somewhere, anywhere. His fingers, usually adept with tools and machinery, felt clumsy on the keyboard. He typed in side hustles for factory workers. Then, how to make money from home after work. The search results loaded a dizzying array of articles, ads, forums. It was overwhelming. He felt a wave of doubt, a surge of the old comfort calling him back. Just go to work, Clayton. This is silly. You're too old for this. But then he saw it, a small article title. Learn a new skill, the key to unlocking untapped potential. It was uncomfortable, facing the blank screen, the vastness of the internet, the acknowledgement of his own ignorance. It felt inefficient, unproductive. It felt like time he should be spending sleeping or preparing for the day. But he clicked it anyway. That click, small as it was the first deliberate step away from the soft, sinking chair of his comfort. The article wasn't a magic key, not by a long shot. It was a dense forest of words Clayton didn't understand. HTML, CSS, JavaScript, terms that sounded like a foreign language to a man whose daily vocabulary revolved around torque wrenches, hydraulic presses, and shift schedules. His eyelids felt like lead weights. The warmth of his bed, the familiar rhythm of pre-dawn quiet, called to him like a siren. This felt inefficient, wasted time. He was already tired before the day even began. The old Clayton would have scoffed, closed the laptop, and crawled back under the covers. But the new Clayton, the one pushed by the image of Mark's hopeful, then slightly deflated face, made himself bookmark the page. He found a beginner's tutorial. Code for Dummies, type deal, and saved it. He read the first 3 paragraphs, letting the strange words wash over him before finally, grudgingly, accepting that his brain had reached its limit. He closed the laptop, the click a stark counterpoint to the quiet dawn, and went to bed for a precious hour of fractured sleep. Day 1 and the battle was already a losing one, or so it felt. But he hadn't quit. Not entirely. The next few mornings, the laptop whirred to life again. The initial surge of decision, that stark resolve, was quickly replaced by a dull ache of fatigue. He was adding hours of intense mental strain to a body already worn by 8 hours of physical labor. He'd come home, eat dinner with Sarah and Lily, his mind half listening to their day, half rehearsing the confusing lines of code he'd struggled with that morning. Then he'd retreat to his corner, the dim glow of the screen illuminating the deepening lines around his eyes. He wrestled with the code like a stubborn machine, prying at each command, trying to understand its purpose. There were times he'd spend an hour on a single misplaced comma, a missing bracket, the smallest error throwing the entire thing into chaos. Frustration built like rust on an old engine. His patience, usually boundless when it came to fixing a broken press, wore thin with these invisible digital components. He'd clench his jaw, stare blankly at the screen, the urge to slam the laptop shut and walk away almost unbearable. "Just let it go, Clayton," the old voice whispered, soft and insidious. "You're not built for this. Go watch some TV, unwind. You deserve it." One evening, after a particularly grueling shift and a fruitless hour of debugging the siren song of comfort won, he simply couldn't. He closed the laptop, didn't even bother to save his progress. He walked straight to the couch, slumped down, and let the mindless drone of the evening news wash over him. Sarah looked at him, a questioning glance. "Everything all right, hun? You look wiped." He just grunted, nodding vaguely. The guilt, however, was a cold knot in his gut. It felt worse than the exhaustion, a deeper, more profound discomfort. It was the guilt of giving up, of betraying that promise to Mark, to himself. The next morning, before the alarm, he was up. The shame of the previous night propelled him. He opened the laptop, his fingers finding the familiar key combinations with a new kind of urgency. He was starting over on that particular problem, but this time he attacked it with a renewed, grim determination. He wouldn't let a single evening of weakness define his path. By the second week, the physical toll was showing. His face was leaner, his eyes often red-rimmed. He was quieter than usual at dinner, his thoughts still grappling with arrays and variables. Sarah started asking more direct questions. "Clayton, what exactly are you doing on that computer? You're hardly sleeping." He struggled to explain. "How do you tell your wife you're trying to reinvent yourself, to become something you're not, for a dream that feels impossibly far off?" "Just trying to learn something new, Sarah. For Mark. For college." His voice was gruff, an automatic defense against the vulnerability of the truth. But amidst the endless loop of frustration, there were tiny, electrifying victories. He managed to create a simple navigation bar that actually linked to different sections of a test page. He made a button change color when he hovered over it. Small things, insignificant to anyone else, but to Clayton, they were monumental. Each successful line of code, each function that finally worked, was a tiny crack in the concrete wall of his self-doubt. It was proof that he wasn't wasting his time entirely. It was proof that he could learn, that he could change. These minuscule breakthroughs were the fuel that kept the internal furnace burning, pushing him through the long, lonely hours of battling the unfamiliar. He wasn't comfortable, not even close. But he was fighting, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like progress. The third week brought with it a subtle but profound change. The raw frustration didn't vanish, not entirely, but it began to mingle with a new kind of satisfaction, a focused clarity that he hadn't felt in years. He started to recognize patterns in the code, predict errors before they happened, and even sometimes write a snippet from memory. It was like learning a new language where suddenly individual words began to string themselves into coherent thoughts. The fog that had perpetually hung over his efforts started to lift, revealing pathways he hadn't seen before. He was still up late, the blue glow of the monitor reflecting in his weary eyes, but the energy felt different. Less like dragging a stubborn mule, more like guiding a powerful, albeit unpredictable, machine. Sarah, usually asleep when he finally climbed into bed, started noticing the shift too. One night she found him at the kitchen table, a notebook open beside his laptop, scribbling diagrams and ideas. He was humming quietly, a low, contented sound. "What's got you so animated?" she asked, a mug of herbal tea in her hand. Her voice was soft, laced with a curiosity that had replaced her earlier concern. Clayton looked up, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "Found a bug in my program, been wrestling with it all night. Just fixed it." He gestured vaguely at the screen where lines of green text confirmed his victory. "It ain't much, but it means the whole thing runs now. Took me 3 days." He didn't elaborate and Sarah didn't push. But she saw the light in his eyes, the subtle easing of the tension in his shoulders that had been a constant companion for weeks. She saw a man who, despite the long hours, seemed more alive. This newfound focus didn't stay confined to the late-night coding sessions. At the factory, he started to look at the assembly line with fresh eyes. He'd always just accepted the inefficiencies, the awkward transitions between stations, the wasted time waiting for parts. Now, his mind, sharpened by the relentless logic of coding, began to see solutions, not just problems. He found himself sketching flowcharts on the back of blueprints during his lunch break, mentally optimizing the path of a component from raw material to finished product. One Tuesday, a critical machine broke down, halting an entire section of the line. The usual panic set in, followed by the familiar wait for the maintenance crew. But Clayton, instead of just standing by, started methodically breaking down the possible points of failure, rattling off questions to the foreman about recent changes, parts orders, and maintenance logs. He wasn't guessing. He was debugging, applying the same systematic approach he used on his computer. Even suggested a couple of checks to the arriving technician that, coincidentally or not, led them straight to the faulty valve. Word started to spread quietly among the guys. "Clayton's been different lately," Frank, a man who'd worked beside him for 20 years, remarked. "Seems sharper somehow, like he's got more gas in the tank." At home, the transformation continued. He wasn't as gruff. He'd still retreat to his computer, but when he emerged, he was more present. He'd actually sit and listen to Lily talk about her day, nodding, sometimes even offering a surprisingly insightful comment. Mark, home for a weekend visit, found his dad staring intently at a spreadsheet, not bills, but a complex series of numbers and formulas. "What's all this, Dad?" Mark asked, leaning over his shoulder. Clayton straightened up, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Just playing around, learning some new tricks for tracking things. For a project I'm thinking about." He showed Mark a dynamically updating table he'd built, illustrating stock levels and ordering points for an imaginary small business. Mark, a computer science major himself, whistled softly. "That's pretty slick, Dad. You built that yourself?" "Every line," Clayton affirmed, a genuine smile replacing his usual slight frown. The approval from his son, the very person who had ignited this whole daunting journey, felt like a powerful balm. It wasn't just about securing Mark's future anymore. It was about proving something to himself, about building something with his own hands, his own mind. He was still working his factory job, still coming home tired, but the profound weariness of stagnation had lifted. In its place was the satisfying ache of progress, the hum of a mind actively engaged. He was no longer just going through the motions. He was moving, truly moving forward. The discomfort was still there, the late nights, the mental strain, the fear of failure, but he now understood it wasn't a wall blocking his path, but the very road itself, stretching out towards a future he was actively, painstakingly building. He hadn't built an empire yet, not even close, but he had started. And in his transformation, he had already gained something far more valuable than money. A renewed sense of purpose and the quiet confidence that he could truly shape his own destiny. Weeks turned into months. Sarah, at first, had simply been relieved that Clayton seemed less heavy. The deep-seated weariness in his shoulders began to ease, replaced by a different kind of fatigue, one that dissipated with a good night's sleep. She noticed the hum of his computer late into the evenings, not the frantic clicking of someone lost, but the steady rhythm of a man building. Sometimes she'd wake to find him sketching diagrams on a notepad, a look of fierce concentration on his face. His gruffness softened too. He still wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, there was a new clarity, a quiet conviction that hadn't been there before. He started talking about logistics optimization and supply chain bottlenecks, terms that meant nothing to her, but the way his eyes lit up as he explained how he could solve them, that meant everything. The fear, that old, nagging companion of hers, began to recede, replaced by a fragile, then strengthening hope. At the factory, the change was more subtle but equally profound. Clayton still punched his clock, still worked his station, but he moved with a different purpose. He observed everything, not just his own task, but the entire flow, the inefficiencies, the moments of wasted effort. He saw the cracks in the system that others simply accepted as the way things are. He wasn't just a cog anymore. He was an engineer, quietly mapping out the machine in his head, even as he greased its gears with his hands. A year and a half later, the scent of stale, oil, and metal dust was a distant memory. The morning alarm still went off at 5 a.m., but now it was to meet a client in downtown Chicago, or to oversee the morning dispatch of his own small fleet of specialized delivery vehicles. Clayton's company, Flowstream Solutions, had started from those late-night spreadsheets and diagrams, born from his intimate knowledge of the factory floor's inefficiencies. He'd seen a problem, no one else was solving it, and he had learned the skills to fix it. He'd started by offering consulting to small local manufacturers, then developed proprietary software for route optimization and inventory management. The initial investment had been terrifying, a second mortgage on the modest house, every penny of their meager savings, and a loan from Sarah's brother. Every fiber of his old self had screamed risk, danger, stay comfortable. But the memory of Mark's face, the image of unfulfilled potential, had been a fiercer motivator. He'd embraced the discomfort of networking, of pitching, of being told no a dozen times before a single yes. He'd learned to code, learned to sell, learned to lead. Mark was thriving at his dream university, his tuition bills now paid not by a desperate father's loan applications, but by a confident father's quarterly profits. Lily, now 17, often helped with social media for Flowstream, her youthful energy a stark contrast to Clayton's methodical approach, but a valuable asset nonetheless. Sarah, who had quietly supported him through every sleepless night and every anxious decision, now managed the company's accounts with a calm efficiency that surprised them both. Their single-story house, while still modest, had seen a few upgrades, a new roof, a renovated kitchen, and a dedicated home office for Clayton, where he still sometimes pulled out a notepad to sketch out a new idea. He still exuded a quiet strength, but it was no longer shadowed by resignation. His watchful gaze now assessed opportunities, not just threats. He still looked like a man who had worked hard his entire life, but now that work was his own. The fear of stagnation had been replaced by the exhilarating discomfort of continuous growth. His million-dollar empire wasn't a glittering tower, but a solid, growing business built on real value, real problem-solving, forged in the crucible of his own willingness to break free from the chains of comfort. One evening, Mark was home for a break, poring over a new coding project. Clayton sat beside him, reviewing some financials. "You know, Mark," he began without looking up, "there was a time I thought being smart meant sticking to what you knew, not rocking the boat." He finally turned, his gaze meeting his son's. "I thought comfort was the goal, a reward." Mark waited, sensing the weight of his father's words. "But comfort," Clayton continued, "it ain't a reward, son. It's a trap. It's like a soft chair that slowly sinks you until you can't get up. The real risk ain't failing, it's never trying 'cause you're too cozy to get off your rear. If it feels too easy, you're probably doing it wrong." He gestured vaguely around the office, then back towards their simple home. "Everything we have now, everything you're doing, it came from leaning into what felt hard, what felt uncomfortable. And that's the truth of it, isn't it?" There was a man who found his path not by avoiding the steep climb, but by embracing the burning in his lungs. He learned that the softest landings are often found after the hardest falls, and the